welcome back to Boring Boris, History for Sleep. Tonight the story will be read by Nathan. Before we begin, I would like to ask you something. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? Write it in the comments if you like. It is always interesting to see how far these quiet stories travel. Now close your eyes if you wish. Let the day slip away and prepare for a calm journey into a strange corner of the ancient world. Our theme tonight may surprise you. The Roman Empire is usually remembered for its soldiers, its roads, and its emperors who held absolute power. But behind the marble and the legions, there was another obsession, one that reveals how far the emperors would go to impress their people and themselves. It was not about gold or new conquests. It was about animals, lions, elephants, rhinos, and even creatures so rare that whole expeditions were organized just to capture them. These animals were brought from the edges of the known world into the heart of Rome. They were displayed in grand arenas, paraded in triumphs, and sometimes kept in private gardens. To the people of Rome, they were symbols of wonder and fear. To the emperors, they were a tool of power, a way to show that no part of the earth was beyond their reach. Tonight we will follow this hidden history. Step by step, we will see how animals became part of politics, entertainment, and imperial vanity. The story will be calm, steady, and quiet. You may drift into sleep at any moment, and that is perfectly fine. Let us begin. Picture yourself entering the city of Rome on the morning of a festival. The air carries the sound of footsteps on stone streets, the call of vendors, and the smell of bread from small ovens. Crowds are moving toward a single destination, the Colosseum. It rises like a mountain of stone, tier after tier, filled with people waiting to be amazed. The emperor has promised a spectacle, not just a battle of gladiators, but something even more impressive, a display of wild beasts brought from faraway lands. For the ordinary citizen, this is a chance to see creatures they could never imagine. For the emperor, it is a performance of power. When the gates open, the animals enter. Lions from North Africa, their golden fur catching the Sunday bears from the forests of the north. Even elephants, massive and deliberate in their steps. The roar of the crowd grows louder with every new sight. To bring these animals to Rome required ships, soldiers, and endless expense. The message is clear. If the emperor can command the beasts of the earth, then he can certainly command his people. The arena is not only a stage for death, it is also a theater of politics. Each beast represents a conquered land, each display a reminder that Rome rules over distant places. When a lion falls under the spear of a gladiator, the crowd cheers, not just for the skill of the fighter, but for the empire itself. It is as if the emperor has tamed the chaos of nature and placed it at the feet of Rome. For the citizens, the sight is both terrifying and reassuring. They fear the claws and the teeth, yet they know that behind the games stands the emperor who has made it all possible. Bread is given freely, wine flows, and the people are reminded of their place within the order of things. They may not own land or wealth, but they share in the spectacle of empire. The animals do not know the meaning of their role. They pace in cages before release, pulled from habitats thousands of miles away. Some have survived weeks on ships across stormy seas. Others have been marched across deserts and mountains. For every beast that reaches the arena, many more have perished along the way. But the Romans count only what appears before their eyes. The losses are forgotten. Imagine the sound of the Colosseum in full voice. Tens of thousands clapping, shouting, gasping, as a rhino lowers its head, or as a leopard leaps from the shadows. The emperor sits in his high seat, calm and unmoved. He knows that this roar is for him, not for the beasts. He has given the people a story they will carry home to every street of the city. They will whisper of the power they witnessed, and his name will rise with their excitement. This was the emperor's stage, a place where animals became instruments of rule, where their lives were used to project an image of control over nature itself. For Rome, it was a symbol of endless reach. For the emperor, it was the ultimate proof that nothing lay beyond his command. And so, the Colosseum became more than a building of stone. It was a mirror of imperial ambition, filled with the echo of roars and applause. Every beast that entered was part of a greater play, the play of empire, power, and pride. Behind the spectacle of the Colosseum stood a reality that few Romans ever saw. To fill the arena with lions, elephants, and leopards was not simply a matter of command. It required an enormous machine of capture, transport, and sacrifice. The price of the hunt was measured not only in gold, but also in lives, both human and animal. Imagine the empire stretching from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Europe and the rivers of Mesopotamia. Within those lands, teams were sent out, tasked with bringing back animals that had never before seen chains or cages. Soldiers marched with nets, ropes, and crude weapons. Hunters, sometimes local guides, risked their lives to track dangerous beasts. The promise of Roman gold tempted them, but the dangers were many. A lion in its native land is not a spectacle, it is a threat. To corner such a creature meant facing claws that could tear through armor and jaws that crushed bone in a single bite. Many hunters never returned, yet the demand was constant because the emperor had promised the people wonder, and wonder could not wait. The logistics were staggering. Picture a giraffe, its long neck rising above a caravan, walking across scorching desert under the guard of Roman soldiers. Imagine elephants loaded onto ships, their massive weight pushing wooden decks to their limit. Each voyage was a gamble. Storms could scatter fleets, and lack of food or water could kill half the cargo. For every animal that reached Rome, several more perished unseen. their bodies abandoned on distant shores. The cost in human labor was no less harsh. Slaves carried fodder and water, built cages from rough timber, and marched endless miles beside the beasts. Whole expeditions could vanish, swallowed by heat, disease, or rebellion. The empire was vast, but even vastness could not protect those who ventured into its wildest corners. And yet, the emperor demanded success. Failure was not an option when the promise of spectacle had been made. Governors of provinces were pressured to deliver. If the Colosseum needed 100 lions, then 100 lions must appear, no matter the price. Whole regions of North Africa were stripped of their great cats. Some areas never recovered. What seemed like endless supply was, in truth, a slow draining of nature itself. The financial burden was equally heavy. Ships had to be built or hired. Men had to be paid, or at least fed. Roads had to be cleared for caravans that might stretch for miles. By the time an animal entered the Colosseum, its cost could equal that of a fine villa or a small estate. But the emperor did not count coins. He counted applause. To him, the roar of the crowd was worth more than silver or gold. There were moments when the price became shockingly visible. Ancient writers tell of festivals where thousands of animals were killed in a single series of games. The numbers are almost impossible to believe, yet they appear again and again in the records. Tigers, lions, bears, even crocodiles, each dragged into the arena only to be slaughtered for the entertainment of the masses. The blood that stained the sand was not only of beasts, but of the empire's resources poured out without end. The people of Rome seldom questioned this waste. Bread was free, the games were dazzling, and life in the crowded city was already harsh. To see wonders was a relief, an escape from hunger and labor. The emperor understood this well. He paid the price of the hunt so that his people would not think of their own struggles, at least for a while. Still, in the quiet corners of the empire, the cost lingered. Farmers saw their livestock seized to feed caravans of elephants. Villages watched their men march away to capture beasts, never to return. Local ecosystems were altered as predators vanished, or as herds were driven to exhaustion. The empire took what it needed, and the scars remained long after the applause in Rome had faded. The price of the hunt, then, was more than coin. It was the slow draining of distant lands, the sacrifice of human lives, and the extinction of animals that once roamed freely. The Colosseum, magnificent as it was, rested on foundations built not only of stone, but of suffering. Each cheer that rose from the crowd was carried on the backs of countless invisible losses. For the Romans in their seats, the games were a gift. For those who labored to make them possible, they were a burden. And for the animals themselves, they were a journey with only one end. The emperor had his glory. The people had their bread and their circus, but the cost was carried by many who would never taste either. Picture the Colosseum on a bright morning. 50,000 people fill the seats, their chatter blending into a low roar of anticipation. The emperor has promised a spectacle never before seen, and word has spread through every street and alley of Rome. Vendors outside sell bread and watered wine, while children perch on their fathers' shoulders to catch a glimpse of history in the making. As the sun rises higher, trumpets blare, the great bronze gates open, and the parade begins. First comes the familiar sight of gladiators in shining armor, their helmets reflecting the light, their shields raised in salute to the emperor. The crowd cheers, but they know this is only the beginning. Behind them, handlers lead great lions brought from the deserts of North Africa. The beasts strain at their chains, manes bristling, paws swiping at the air. The sound of their roars rolls across the arena, and some spectators instinctively flinch even from high in the stands. Next, the parade grows stranger. From the eastern provinces, tigers are brought forth, striped shadows pacing behind wooden barriers. Few in the crowd have ever seen such creatures. For most Romans, these animals might as well have been monsters from myth. Yet, here they are, snarling and alive, proof that the emperor can command nature itself. Children point, elders whisper prayers, and the name of the emperor echoes like a chant. Then come the elephants, enormous and otherworldly, their hides marked with paint and their tusks wrapped in gleaming metal. The crowd gasps at the sheer size of them. Each step shakes the ground. Some carry platforms with archers or musicians, a strange mix of entertainment and intimidation. The message is clear. Rome has reached so far into the world that even the largest beasts walk in chains for her. But the most astonishing moments are reserved for rarities. Imagine the shock when a hippopotamus was led into the arena, its massive body glistening from the long journey up the Nile. Romans had read about such creatures in old accounts, but few believed them real. The emperor had turned legend into reality. Later, a giraffe appeared, its long neck swaying gracefully above the handlers' heads. To the Roman people, this seemed almost supernatural, a being stitched together from several animals at once. The atmosphere during these parades was electric. It was not just a show, it was a declaration. The emperor was telling his people that no corner of the earth lay beyond his grasp. Every creature paraded through the Colosseum was a living symbol of conquest, a walking trophy that represented the farthest reaches of Roman ambition. As the parade continued, the ground would be transformed into elaborate stage sets. Sand was hauled in by the cartload, trees planted temporarily, rivers mocked up with wooden troughs filled with water. Entire landscapes were built within the Colosseum just for a single day. Lions chased deer across artificial forests. Crocodiles were set loose in pools, and hunters waded through reeds to strike at them with spears. These spectacles were not merely cruel sport. They were theater, on the grandest scale imaginable. The people were enthralled, but beneath the wonder lay a darker truth. The scale of the spectacle required enormous cost. Thousands of animals had to be captured, transported, fed, and housed before their brief moment in the arena. Ships carried cages across stormy seas. Caravans trudged across deserts, men dying from thirst and exhaustion, all to deliver a single animal that might be killed within minutes. Yet in the minds of the Roman crowd, the suffering was invisible. All they saw was the glory of Rome on display, the living proof that their empire had no equal. When the emperor waved from his seat, basking in the admiration of tens of thousands, he knew his message had landed. He was not simply a ruler of men, but a master of beasts, a figure who bent the natural world itself to his will. The parades of exotic animals were never just about novelty. They were tools of power, carefully designed performances to remind the Roman people that their emperor stood above them all. To witness a tiger pacing across the sand or an elephant bowing its head was to witness the empire embodied, immense, untouchable, and eternal. By the end of the day, the Colosseum floor was stained with sweat, blood, and sand. But the crowd left buzzing with awe. They had seen creatures they could barely describe to their neighbors, animals so strange they seemed pulled from the realm of dreams. And behind it all, one truth was driven home with every roar, every trumpet, every spectacle. Rome ruled not only people and lands, but the very wonders of creation itself. Behind every grand parade in Rome lay a story that was far less glamorous. To fill the Colosseum with lions, tigers, elephants, or even stranger creatures like hippopotamuses and giraffes, the empire had to reach deep into its territories and beyond. This was not a simple task. It was a logistical nightmare that consumed wealth, manpower, and human lives. The audience in Rome saw the finished spectacle, but they rarely thought about the price that had been paid to make it possible. The hunt often began thousands of miles from the capital. In the deserts of North Africa, hunters were hired to capture lions and leopards. These men worked in teams, setting traps near waterholes, digging pits camouflaged with branches, or attempting to snare beasts with ropes and nets. Many did not return. A lion cornered in the wild was no less deadly than in the arena, and countless hunters were mauled or killed before a single animal could be dragged away in chains. In the dense forests of India and the mountains of Armenia, the search for tigers and bears pushed men into dangerous terrain. Tracking a tiger meant following paw prints for days, knowing that the predator might be watching from the shadows. Even if the hunters succeeded, moving such animals across rivers, jungles, and rocky paths was an ordeal. Each cage required oxen, carts, and guards to keep the beasts alive until they reached the sea. Then came the ships. Exotic animals were loaded onto vessels that had never been designed to carry such cargo. Lions and leopards were chained in dark holds. Elephants crowded onto reinforced decks. giraffes awkwardly tethered to prevent them from toppling in rough seas. Storms could wipe out entire shipments, drowning animals and crew alike. Diseases spread quickly in cramped conditions, and many animals died long before they ever reached Italy. The emperor, however, cared only that enough survived to impress the crowd. Once the creatures arrived in port, another burden fell upon the empire. They had to be housed, fed, and trained for months before the spectacle. Elephants consumed staggering amounts of grain and water every day. Lions demanded fresh meat, often from herds purchased at imperial expense. Tigers refused to eat when stressed, wasting away unless carefully coaxed. The cost of maintaining these animals was immense. Some historians estimate that single games could drain the treasury of a wealthy province, all for a few hours of entertainment. The human toll was equally severe. Captives taken in wars were often forced into the dangerous work of tending animals. Slaves fed the beasts, cleaned their cages, and risked their lives to move them into the arena. Many were mauled or killed in accidents that never reached the ears of the Roman public. To the crowd, the animals appeared as if conjured from thin air, but behind the curtain there was suffering on every side. The emperors themselves sometimes ignored these costs, driven by their obsession with outdoing their predecessors. If one emperor had paraded 100 lions, the next sought 200. If elephants had already been shown, then rhinos or crocodiles were demanded. The quest for novelty pushed the limits of what was possible. Shipwrecks, bankruptcies, and entire trade networks were strained under the weight of this imperial hunger for spectacle. There is also the ecological toll to consider. In North Africa, the once plentiful lions that roamed the deserts and grasslands were hunted nearly to extinction for the games. Species that were once abundant across the empire dwindled in number, some disappearing entirely from certain regions. Rome consumed not just human wealth, but the very fabric of nature in its pursuit of grandeur. And yet, despite the staggering price, the spectacles continued. Why? Because the people demanded it, and the emperors understood the political value. A bloody, roaring spectacle distracted from food shortages, from military defeats, from political intrigue, bread and circuses, as the saying went, were enough to keep the masses loyal. No cost was too high if it meant securing the image of a ruler who could command both men and beasts. For the Romans sitting in the marble seats of the Colosseum, the cost was invisible. They clapped and shouted as elephants bowed, as lions leapt from cages, as crocodiles snapped their jaws. The reality of lost lives, wasted fortunes, and ruined landscapes lay hidden far away, carried on the backs of slaves and the sweat of unnamed hunters. The Colosseum shone as a place of glory, but its foundations were built on sacrifice that stretched across continents. The price of the hunt was never paid by the emperors or the cheering citizens. It was paid in the blood of hunters, in the sweat of slaves, in the silence of vanished species, and in the exhaustion of provinces forced to serve the endless appetite of Rome. The games dazzled the crowd for a day, but the empire itself bore the scars for centuries. When we imagine the power of Rome, we often think of legions marching in formation, aqueducts carrying water across valleys, or marble temples gleaming in the sunday. Yet another, stranger expression of that power was hidden in the movement of animals. To bring a giraffe from Africa, a tiger from India, or an elephant from Numidia to the heart of the empire was not a sideshow. It was a demonstration that Rome could bend not only men, but also nature itself to its will. The task began at the edges of empire. Provincial governors received orders from the emperor to secure certain beasts. These governors, in turn, pushed the demand onto local kings, tribal leaders, and hunters. In Africa, men tracked lions across the scrublands, driving them into traps with fire and noise. In Egypt, crocodiles were captured near the Nile with ropes and nets. In Asia, emissaries sought out elephants or exotic birds, negotiating with kingdoms that were not always Rome's subjects. What followed was not just hunting, but a vast system of tribute, coercion, and trade. Once captured, the challenge of survival began. Animals had to be moved over hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles. Special cages were built from heavy timber, reinforced with iron. For predators like leopards and tigers, these cages were covered in thick cloth to calm them. Elephants were shackled and led with handlers who knew how to control them with sharp prods and food rewards. The journey itself could last months, even years, and at every stage, men risked their lives to keep the beasts alive. River crossings presented constant dangers. A barge could capsize under the weight of a panicked elephant. Crocodiles thrashed in their crates, sometimes breaking free and causing chaos among the crew. Overland travel was equally brutal. Roads that carried grain carts were suddenly crowded with wagons hauling snarling predators. Bands of guards had to be hired to prevent escape or theft, since the animals were as valuable as treasure. Sea voyages were the most perilous. Galleys had to be strengthened to bear cages, their decks crowded with hay, fodder, and chains. Sailors complained of the stench, the noise, and the fear of predators breaking loose in a storm. Many animals perished on these crossings, either from disease, thirst, or panic. A shipment of lions lost to drowning was as devastating financially as the sinking of a cargo of silver. Still, emperors demanded replacements, so the process never ceased. Once the animals reached Italy, the machinery of spectacle took over. Temporary camps were built near ports to house them. Teams of slaves carried out endless feeding duties. Donkeys slaughtered for lions, bushels of grain for elephants, flocks of birds for raptors. Trainers attempted to make the animals respond to cues so they could be released dramatically in the arena. Some succeeded, others did not. Failures were hidden. Only the polished display reached the public eye. The scale of the operation is almost beyond belief. Historians estimate that during the inauguration of the Colosseum under Titus, Over 5,000 animals were killed in a single set of games. Imagine the network required to bring that many creatures into one city at once. Ships crossing seas, caravans trudging across deserts, hunters risking death in forests, and bureaucrats recording every expense. It was not a single event, but the product of an empire working in concert. The costs were staggering. Provincial treasuries were emptied to pay hunters, shipbuilders, and guards. Cities groaned under new taxes, meant to cover the expense of keeping wild animals alive. Human lives were casually spent in the process. From hunters mauled in capture to slaves killed in transport accidents. And yet, the emperor did not count these costs. For him, the very difficulty of the task was part of the point. To make the impossible happen was to prove that Rome itself was without limit. This obsession with the impossible had consequences. Lions, once common in North Africa, dwindled as they were captured by the thousands. Elephants from the forests of North Africa were hunted to extinction in Roman times. Local communities, stripped of resources, were left impoverished. Still, the supply lines continued, because the demand for spectacle never faded. In the end, the logistics of transporting exotic animals were not just about entertainment. They were about showing that the emperor could command the uncommandable, that his reach extended from the deserts of Africa to the jungles of Asia. Each beast in the Colosseum was not only an animal, but also a symbol, proof that Rome could harness the wildest corners of the earth. When people today picture the Colosseum, they imagine gladiators locked in combat or wild beasts leaping from cages. What is often forgotten is the enormous human cost hidden behind those brief moments of spectacle. Every exotic animal that appeared in the arena required not only treasure, but also flesh and blood. For the Romans, it was easy to cheer when a lion was slain or a rhinoceros brought to its knees. But behind the roar of the crowd stood thousands of nameless people who paid the price for the emperor's obsession. The most obvious victims were the hunters and trappers. To capture a lion in North Africa, men risked death every day. They dug pits, laid traps, or drove animals toward nets with fire and spears. Many never returned. A single swipe from a lion's paw could end a life. Crocodile hunters along the Nile slipped into the river with ropes, their companions praying they would not be dragged beneath the surface. Elephant catchers in Numidia relied on courage more than skill, often dying beneath the very creatures they hoped to deliver to Rome. These men were rarely volunteers. Most were slaves, debtors, or local villagers forced into service by governors under pressure to meet imperial demands. Even once the animals were captured, the suffering did not end. Long journeys required handlers, guards, and sailors who lived in constant danger. Imagine being assigned to guard a wagon carrying a caged leopard. At night, the animal paced and snarled, while the guards fought exhaustion and fear. A mistake meant claws through the bars. On ships, Sailors cursed their fate when they were ordered to sleep above a hold full of wild animals. Storms turned the decks into chaos, with cages rattling and beasts screaming in panic. If a lion broke loose at sea, everyone on board became a potential victim. Then there were the slaves who fed and trained the animals once they reached Italy. To walk into a pen carrying a bucket of meat was a death sentence waiting to happen. A hungry lion could kill in seconds. Trainers sometimes attempted to condition the beasts for staged performances, using whips, fire, or starvation. Failures were punished not with scolding but with death, since the emperor demanded perfection. These men were invisible to history, yet their lives were consumed in the service of Roman entertainment. And finally came the performers themselves. The venators, or beast fighters, were not always skilled gladiators. Many were condemned criminals, prisoners of war, or slaves offered up to the crowd. They entered the arena armed with little more than a spear or a net, facing lions, tigers, or bears. Few survived long. To the Roman public, their deaths were part of the thrill. The suffering of a man devoured by a beast was not hidden, it was the point. Even children were sometimes forced into the arena, their fate sealed for the sake of spectacle. The cost extended beyond the bloodshed in the sand. Provinces drained resources to supply animals, which meant ordinary people lost wealth and labor. Farmers who should have been tending fields were diverted to build cages or cut fodder. Caravans that might have carried grain instead hauled beasts, leaving communities hungry. Taxes rose, debts multiplied, and resentment brewed. For many subjects of Rome, the emperor's obsession with exotic animals was not awe-inspiring, but suffocating. The cruelty was not unnoticed even in antiquity. Some Roman writers commented on the waste, criticizing emperors who emptied treasuries for the sake of a single spectacle. Philosophers like Seneca argued that such displays hardened the public's heart, teaching citizens to take pleasure in suffering. Yet these voices were drowned out by the roar of the masses. Bread and circuses were enough to keep the people loyal, and emperors knew it. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is how routine this suffering became. The capture, transport, and death of both animals and humans turned into a system, one that persisted for centuries. Each festival demanded more bodies, and each new emperor sought to outdo the last. It was a cycle of cruelty disguised as entertainment, a machine that chewed through lives at a pace no one dared to challenge. When we remember Rome's greatness, it is tempting to admire the scale of its games. But to truly understand them, we must also remember the price. The Colosseum was not just a place of glory. It was a graveyard of both beasts and men, a monument built on suffering. Behind every roar of the crowd lay silence, the silence of those who never returned from the hunt, the silence of slaves who died in cages, the silence of criminals torn apart under the eyes of a cheering empire. When we picture the exotic animals of Rome, lions instantly come to mind. The king of beasts was the ultimate symbol of power, and emperors ensured that no festival was complete without them. Lions roared across the Colosseum floor, their manes blazing under the sun, their presence terrifying and captivating the audience. But lions were only the beginning. Rome's appetite for spectacle demanded a bestiary so vast that it sometimes reads like a fantasy. Tigers, for instance, were far rarer. They were not native to Africa, but to the distant reaches of India and Central Asia. Capturing and transporting a tiger across thousands of miles was a miracle of logistics. Roman audiences regarded them as supernatural creatures, striped demons from the edges of the world. When one appeared in the arena, the crowd would surge to its feet. For emperors, presenting a tiger was not just entertainment, it was a political statement. It said Rome's reach extended so far that even the wildest beasts of distant lands could be brought in chains to serve the empire's pleasure. Bears, especially from the forests of Europe, were more common but no less fearsome. They were used in brutal displays where unarmed prisoners were thrown to them. Sometimes multiple bears were released at once, lumbering across the sand with terrifying strength. Wolves were also hunted for the games, an ironic twist considering Rome's mythical origin story of Romulus and Remus suckled by a she-wolf. What once symbolized Rome's foundation now served as fodder for its bloodlust. Elephants offered a different kind of wonder. Brought from North Africa or even farther afield in India, they were paraded in grand processions before being forced into combat. Sometimes they fought against armed men. Other times they were pitted against other animals. One record tells of elephants facing groups of bulls, a clash engineered purely for novelty. The sheer size of the creatures amazed the crowd, but their suffering often left a darker impression. When the animals trumpeted in fear and pain, even the bloodthirsty Roman audience sometimes fell silent. Cicero once noted that elephants seemed to possess a near-human intelligence, and some spectators were disturbed to see them forced into slaughter. Perhaps the strangest of all were the hippopotamuses and rhinoceroses. Transported from the Nile and sub-Saharan Africa, they were not only dangerous, but difficult to keep alive. Their massive bodies required enormous amounts of food and water. Records suggest that Augustus staged one of the earliest hippopotamus hunts in Rome, shocking audiences who had never seen such a beast. Later emperors continued the tradition, parading rhinos whose horns gleamed under the Mediterranean Sunday. The risk of moving these creatures was enormous, yet their rarity made them priceless tokens of imperial authority. Even giraffes made appearances. Julius Caesar famously displayed the first giraffe ever seen in Rome during his triumph of 46 BCE. The animal's long neck and elegant gait seemed otherworldly to the crowd, who called it the camel leopard because it resembled both a camel and a spotted cat. To parade a giraffe through the streets was to show that the empire's grasp extended into the most distant corners of Africa. Birds, too, were not forgotten. Ostriches, flamingos, and peacocks were imported for banquets and spectacles. Ostriches in particular fascinated the Romans, not just for their speed, but also for the challenge of killing them in the arena. Later emperors, like Heliogabalus, are said to have served extravagant dishes made from ostrich brains or peacock tongues, blurring the line between entertainment and grotesque indulgence. Each of these creatures carried meaning beyond mere curiosity. Lions symbolized strength, elephants symbolized conquest, giraffes symbolized novelty, and tigers symbolized Rome's global reach. The animals themselves became metaphors for empire, conquered, displayed, and ultimately destroyed for the glory of one man's reign. The sheer diversity of species captured is staggering. Scholars estimate that during some festivals, thousands of animals of every type were killed in a single day. Yet what is most striking is not simply the number of beasts, but the scale of imagination behind their use. Romans did not want to see just one lion or one elephant. They wanted dozens, even hundreds, released into artificial landscapes built inside the arena. Forests, deserts, and rivers were recreated in wood and canvas, stocked with animals torn from their habitats. The games became a distorted mirror of the natural world, compressed into an afternoon's entertainment. In the end, these exotic beasts tell us more about Rome than about nature. They reveal a culture obsessed with control, determined to prove that nothing, whether human or animal, could resist its grasp. The men who sat in the imperial box believed they ruled not only over nations, but over creation itself. To understand why emperors invested so heavily in exotic beasts, we need to see the arena not as entertainment, but as politics in action. The Colosseum was not simply a theater of blood. It was a stage where emperors performed their power before the people of Rome. Every roar of a lion, every charge of an elephant, every shriek of a doomed animal reinforced the same message. The empire was limitless, and its ruler was the master of both nature and man. The spectacle of animals was particularly effective because it appealed to every level of society. To the poor, who rarely traveled beyond their villages, seeing a tiger or a hippo was like gazing into another world. It stirred awe and gratitude toward the emperor who had made such a vision possible. To the elite, the games demonstrated the reach of Rome's supply chains and the emperor's ability to marshal enormous resources. To soldiers, it mirrored conquest, itself the empire subduing foreign lands and creatures. The political purpose was clearest in the venaciones, the staged animal hunts. These were not mere hunts, but elaborate recreations of foreign landscapes. The arena could be transformed into a desert, a forest, or even a river, complete with artificial scenery and elaborate machinery. Into this fabricated wilderness, dozens or hundreds of animals were released at once. Hunters, often dressed in exotic costumes, would fight them, all under the watchful eye of the emperor. The symbolism was unmistakable. Rome could summon the farthest corners of the earth and control them within the walls of the city. The sheer numbers shocked contemporaries, During Titus's inaugural games for the Colosseum in 80 CE, ancient sources claim thousands of animals were killed in a single day. Some records describe 5,000 beasts destroyed in a matter of hours. For the spectators, it was overwhelming. For the emperor, it was a calculated investment. By delivering a scale of entertainment that no rival could match, he secured loyalty and silenced dissent. But these spectacles were not just about quantity, they were about variety. A lion fighting a man was impressive, but a lion fighting a bear or an elephant clashing with a rhinoceros was unforgettable. The novelty kept the audience engaged, and the unpredictability gave the events a sense of raw chaos, carefully managed by imperial authority. The more astonishing the pairings, the greater the emperor's prestige. Critics, however, were not absent. Some Roman writers condemned the waste, noting the immense financial cost and the needless cruelty. Cicero once commented that the suffering of elephants in the games disturbed many spectators because the animals seemed too intelligent to be slaughtered for sport. Yet even moral hesitation could be twisted into political advantage. An emperor who provided such spectacles could appear both magnanimous and unstoppable, willing to offer the crowd what no one else dared. The games also acted as a release valve for the city's tensions. In a society where grain shortages, high taxes, and political strife could ignite riots, keeping the populace entertained was a matter of survival. The famous phrase, "bread and circuses," captures this logic perfectly. By filling bellies with free grain and eyes with endless spectacle, emperors bought themselves peace. The animals were pawns in this bargain, sacrificed to maintain the illusion of stability. What lingers today is the paradox. The same empire that built aqueducts, roads, and laws also built spectacles of death. For the emperors, there was no contradiction. Displaying lions and tigers in combat was as much a demonstration of Roman order as an aqueduct carrying water. Both were proof that Rome had the resources, the skill, and the will to shape the world as it pleased. In the Colosseum's sand, politics took a visceral form. The people did not simply hear about Rome's dominion, they saw it, smelt it, and cheered as it unfolded before them. Every exotic beast slain was another reminder that the emperor ruled over nature itself. And in a city where power was fragile and fleeting, that illusion could be the most valuable weapon of all. Beyond the Colosseum, the obsession with exotic animals spilled into private life. Public shows were designed to impress the masses, but the emperors and elite also competed in more personal displays. If an emperor could parade lions in front of tens of thousands, imagine the impact of keeping one in his garden. The menagerie became a living emblem of wealth and authority, a quieter but no less powerful stage for imperial vanity. Roman villas, particularly those of the emperors, often featured landscape grounds that rivaled the scale of small towns. Within these estates, animals were not just ornaments, but proof of reach. A giraffe grazing on imported plants or a panther pacing behind gilded bars spoke volumes. These creatures had been dragged across seas and deserts, fed with expensive grain and guarded by servants. Their very survival in a foreign climate was a triumph of resources. To see them was to see the empire compressed into a private enclosure. The practice of keeping animals for private amusement had roots long before Rome. In Egypt and the Near East, pharaohs had once kept crocodiles and baboons. Kings of Assyria displayed lions. But Rome amplified the scale. The emperors treated the empire as a net cast wide, drawing in anything rare or fearsome. Augustus reportedly showcased a rhinoceros in one of his triumphs, and later rulers extended the tradition. Caligula, known for his eccentricity, allegedly kept wild animals as casually as others kept pets, using them to shock visiting dignitaries. Private collections also served a diplomatic purpose. To present a guest with a tour of one's menagerie was to remind them of the emperor's invisible empire, stretching into climates and regions beyond imagination. Exotic beasts were gifts in themselves. Foreign rulers sometimes sent them as tribute, knowing they would flatter Roman pride. A single elephant or leopard could symbolize not just the generosity of an ally, but the submission of a province. The logistics were staggering. Animals had to be transported alive across oceans and mountains, housed in secure pens, and fed diets far removed from their native habitats. Special handlers, often slaves or specialists from the animals' original lands, were brought along to care for them. For every creature that survived the journey, many more perished en route. Yet the risk only heightened the value of those that reached the emperor's villa. Certain emperors took this further. Elagabalus, the notorious 3rd century ruler, was infamous for his bizarre indulgences, reportedly unleashing animals at banquets to startle guests. While some accounts may exaggerate, they capture the sense that animals had become part of an emperor's theatrical identity. To command them, even in absurd or dangerous ways, was to prove dominance over both nature and man. These private displays were not limited to emperors. Wealthy senators and generals also kept exotic animals, though never in the same numbers. For them, a leopard lounging in a courtyard or a monkey trained to perform tricks was a way to signal sophistication and worldliness. It was conspicuous consumption in its most literal form, to own what no one else could, and to make it live within reach. The existence of these menageries blurred the line between entertainment and exploitation. To modern eyes, a zoo suggests curiosity, even education. For Rome, the animals were rarely studied. They were trophies. Their survival was not for their own sake, but to reflect glory onto their master. Their deaths, too, could be part of the drama. A beast displayed in a garden 1 month might be marched into the arena the next, its life ending as another piece of political theatre. What makes these collections striking is how fragile they were. An aqueduct or a road could last centuries, but a menagerie vanished the moment its keeper died or lost power. Animals starved, escaped, or were absorbed into new shows. The private zoo was a fleeting statement, a burst of extravagance that disappeared as quickly as it had been assembled. Yet during its brief existence, it told everyone who saw it that the world itself could be captured and caged by Rome's rulers. In these quiet courtyards and grand villas, away from the cheers of the Colosseum, Rome's obsession revealed its most personal face. Exotic animals were no longer just instruments of mass spectacle. They were mirrors of the emperors themselves, rare, dangerous, out of place, and destined to live only as long as the empire could sustain its illusions. When studying the emperors of Rome, one cannot ignore their eccentricities, and nowhere were these quirks more apparent than in their relationships with animals. The empire's rulers, accustomed to absolute authority, often projected their desires onto the living creatures they collected. What began as political theater in the arena sometimes spilled into daily life, producing stories that ranged from the bizarre to the outright unsettling. Caligula stands as the prime example. Known for his unhinged behavior, he is often remembered for elevating his horse Incitatus to near-human status. Ancient sources describe how the horse was fed oats mixed with gold flakes, stabled in marble, and draped in purple cloths. Whether Caligula truly intended to make Incitatus a consul, or whether this was political satire by later historians, remains debated. But the tale reveals a deeper truth. For Caligula, animals were not just companions. They were props in his performance of madness and superiority, reminders that his power was boundless and could rewrite the natural order itself. Nero, another infamous figure, also turned animals into symbols of his peculiar rule. While Nero's passion for music and theater is better documented, he reportedly delighted in staging private games involving animals, sometimes in the gardens of his golden house. Unlike the structured displays of the Colosseum, these were intimate spectacles for selected audiences. Lions and panthers were paraded as though they were part of Nero's artistic expression, blurring the line between performance and cruelty. Other emperors used animals to assert power in subtler ways. Augustus, the first emperor, understood their political value. He famously staged triumphs where exotic beasts were paraded as proof of Rome's expanding reach. His shows were carefully curated, reinforcing the idea that he had brought order not only to the empire, but to nature itself. For Augustus, the animal was never just a curiosity. It was a tool of propaganda, a way of saying that under his rule, even the wildest parts of the world bent to Roman control. Domitian, who ruled in the late 1st century, cultivated an image of himself as a hunter king. He built a special arena on the Palatine Hill, where he personally killed wild animals in staged hunts. To the Roman elite, this straddled the line between admirable skill and alarming vanity. It suggested a ruler more interested in playing games with beasts than governing his people. Yet in Domitian's mind, the act of slaying exotic creatures in front of an audience was another way to embody dominance. Elagabalus, perhaps the strangest of all, took the imperial fascination to grotesque levels. Ancient writers accuse him of hosting banquets where he unleashed wild animals among the diners, forcing guests to scramble for safety. Though the accuracy of these accounts is disputed, the stories reflect a broader perception that Rome's rulers often indulged in cruelty disguised as spectacle. Elagabalus's use of animals was not to impress or awe, but to destabilize, to remind everyone that life under his rule was unpredictable and dangerous. These anecdotes, whether exaggerated or not, show how animals became extensions of an emperor's personality. For the people of Rome, hearing that Caligula adored his horse, or that Elagabalus terrorized guests with lions, was not simply gossip. It was a commentary on the empire itself. The treatment of animals mirrored the treatment of subjects, creatures to be paraded, disciplined, or sacrificed at the whim of a single man. It is important to recognize that not all emperors were reckless. Some valued animals for their novelty or beauty rather than their shock value. Hadrian, for instance, was fascinated by Greek culture and reportedly maintained more orderly collections, focusing on the symbolic weight of animals in art and religion. To him, they were not tools of chaos, but emblems of a cultured, cosmopolitan empire. What unites these stories is not the accuracy of every detail, but the underlying message. Exotic animals were never neutral. In the hands of emperors, they became part of a larger performance, a stage on which rulers revealed both their grandeur and their flaws. The lion in a courtyard, the horse in a gilded stall, the rhino in an arena, all were symbols of men who believed their power had no limits. Through these peculiar habits, we see more than eccentric rulers. We glimpse an empire intoxicated by its own dominance, convinced that even the natural world existed to be collected, caged, and commanded. And in that, the animals of Rome become more than curiosities. They become silent witnesses to the excesses of power. The Roman appetite for spectacle reached its height in the events known as venationes, the staged hunts and battles between humans and exotic animals. To the citizens of Rome, these were more than entertainments. They were a statement of empire, a visual proof that no corner of the world was beyond Roman control. Every beast dragged into the arena symbolized a conquered land. Every kill a reminder that Rome's reach extended from the deserts of Africa to the mountains of Asia. A typical venatio unfolded in dazzling fashion. The arena floor was transformed into an imitation of foreign landscapes, sand dunes, forests, even artificial lakes. Workers hauled in painted backdrops, trees rooted in boxes, and props to create the illusion of wilderness. Then came the animals, lions, leopards, bears, elephants, even crocodiles. Their sudden release sent a shiver through the crowd. The noise of thousands of spectators, the blare of horns, and the clash of weapons set the stage for what followed. The hunters, called bestiari, were not always slaves or criminals. Many were trained professionals who specialized in combating wild beasts. To fight a lion with only a spear or a net was a deadly profession, but also one that carried prestige. Success in the arena meant fame, rewards, and sometimes freedom. Their battles were brutal, yet they carried a sense of theatrical choreography. The audience expected not just death, but drama moments of suspense, daring escapes, and displays of courage that mirrored the larger ideals of Roman dominance. What makes the Venazioni so shocking is their scale. Records from the inauguration of the Colosseum under Titus in the year 80 AD describe 100 days of games in which thousands of animals were killed. Elephants, giraffes, and hippos were dragged from distant provinces at immense cost, only to die in front of cheering crowds. Later, emperors sought to outdo one another, escalating the numbers in a competition of extravagance. The more animals slaughtered, the greater the emperor's reputation for generosity and power. But these events were not simply mass executions. Sometimes the animals were made to fight each other. Spectators gasped as a bear squared off against a bull, or as lions were set upon packs of wild dogs. The contests were designed to surprise, to create moments no Roman had seen before. Each novelty deepened the sense that the empire was limitless, capable of bending nature into whatever form it desired. The logistics behind these spectacles were staggering. Animals had to be captured, transported across seas, fed, and kept alive long enough to reach the capital. The costs were astronomical, draining treasuries and exhausting provinces. Yet for emperors, the expense was worth it. To provide such a show was to secure the loyalty of the Roman populace, who viewed free games as proof that their ruler cared for them. Bread might feed the body, but the arena fed the imagination. There were also moral debates, even in antiquity. Philosophers like Seneca and Pliny the Younger criticized the waste and cruelty of the spectacles. They argued that constant exposure to blood dulled the public's sense of compassion, yet such voices were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. For most Romans, the Venetians were not about ethics, but identity. To watch elephants parade through the Colosseum was to feel that Rome's power stretched across the earth. What strikes modern readers is the mixture of wonder and horror. To imagine a hippo dragged into an arena far from its river, or a giraffe bewildered by the shouts of thousands, is to confront the extremes of imperial ambition. These were not events born of necessity. They were displays staged to remind everyone, citizen, senator, or foreign envoy, that the emperor commanded life and death on a scale no one else could match. In the end, the Veneraciones were less about the animals themselves and more about what they represented. They were currency in the politics of spectacle, tokens in the emperor's ongoing performance of absolute authority. And though the animals perished, the memory of the games lingered, reinforcing the myth that Rome was not just a city or an empire, but the very center of the world. When you think of the Colosseum, you may imagine a simple arena of sand and stone. Yet in truth, it was not only a stage for men and animals, but a theater of transformation. Roman engineers turned the space into shifting worlds. What looked like bare ground in the morning could, by afternoon, resemble a forest clearing, a desert plain, or even a shallow sea. The illusion was as important as the animals themselves. Hidden beneath the arena floor was a labyrinth of corridors, lifts, and cages. Wooden platforms rose through trapdoors, bringing wild beasts suddenly into the sunlight. One moment, the ground was empty. The next, a lion bounded out. As if from nowhere, crowds gasped, not only at the sight of the animal, but at the magic of its arrival. The element of surprise was part of the power. Scenery mattered as much as the combat. Painted backdrops, artificial rocks, and scattered trees created an environment where animals appeared almost at home. For a moment, the audience could believe they were gazing into Africa or Asia without leaving Rome. The scale of illusion gave depth to the spectacle. It was not just blood that held attention, but the strangeness of seeing distant lands materialize before their eyes. Water displays offered the boldest illusions. With clever drainage and pulleys, the floor of the arena could be flooded to host staged hunts with crocodiles or mock naval battles. Spectators marveled at hippos wallowing in pools that had not existed hours before. The ability to summon rivers and seas at will gave the emperor an aura of near-divine control over nature. Animals played roles in these shifting stages that went beyond fighting. Sometimes they were props in stories retold through performance. A myth of Hercules might be acted with a real lion. A tale of Artemis could feature live deer. In these moments, beasts were not mere victims, but living symbols that lent weight to legend. The boundary between play and reality blurred. The cruelty remained clear. Exotic animals seldom survived long in such displays. Stress, injury, and exhaustion claimed them, even if combat did not. But for the Romans in the seats, each death carried less importance than the marvel of the show itself. What lingered in memory was not pity, but astonishment at what had been achieved. The forest built on sand, the sea raised from dry stone, the beast brought from a continent away. The architecture of wonder served a political function. By shaping the Colosseum into a world that could be altered at command, emperors reminded citizens that Rome itself commanded the world outside. The empire gathered animals, water, wood, and stone from across its reach. All these pieces met in one place and danced to the will of the ruler. The illusion of nature under control mirrored the claim of empire over chaos. This constant reshaping of the arena explains why records speak of thousands of animals slain in a single festival. It was not only combat that required such numbers, but also the need to keep each scene full and convincing. A forest demanded flocks of deer and packs of wolves. A river required crocodiles and hippos. Each transformation consumed life, and life was cheap when weighed against glory. Yet behind the mechanics was still a sense of artistry. Roman writers described the marvel of painted scenery, the gleam of water, the shadows cast by temporary trees. Guests came not only to watch killing, but to be immersed in a world they could not find outside those walls. For all its blood, the Colosseum was also a kind of museum of the impossible. When the crowd left at dusk, the illusions vanished. Workers cleared carcasses, drained pools, dismantled trees, and rolled away backdrops. By night, the arena returned to bare sand. But for those who had watched, the memory endured. They had seen deserts bloom, seas rise, and forests fall within a single day. That was the gift of the emperor, to conjure entire worlds and to let them vanish at his will. A quiet garden behind high walls tells a different story than the roar of a crowd. In this shaded place, the air smells of herbs and wet stone. A pool reflects the sky. From a nearby enclosure comes the slow breath of a large animal at rest. This is not the Colosseum. This is a private stage where power is displayed without witnesses. Private collections flourished for reasons of pride and control. A beast in the arena belonged to the people for a single afternoon. A beast in a villa belonged to its owner every day. To feed it, to walk past it after dinner, to show it to chosen guests made power feel near and tangible. A lion, pacing behind bars, said more than a mural. It said that distance had been conquered and that nature could be made to linger. There was rivalry too. Senators competed for marble and gardens, for libraries and baths, and soon for animals. A man who could provide a leopard at a banquet or point to cranes by an artificial lake announced that his network reached from Africa to Asia. The creature was proof of connections, money, and imperial favor. Even when the emperor kept the grandest collections, the elite mirrored him in smaller forms. Diplomacy fed the habit. Provincial rulers learned that an unusual animal was a safer gift than gold and more memorable than cloth. A single elephant offered for peace would be remembered for years. The animal lived on the estate, ate from Roman stores, and reminded every visitor that a foreign king had bent the knee. Symbolism added weight. Certain animals carried meanings. Eagles and lions hinted at dignity. Peacocks spoke of beauty and immortality. Even gentle gazelles could stand for a gracious house. To place these meanings in a living body inside a private space felt like keeping a virtue close. There were practical motives. Training beasts in quiet quarters prepared them for future shows. An elephant that learned to obey signals in a villa could later surprise the crowd. A tamer who knew a particular leopard calmed it with voice and food, lowering risk in the arena. In this way, private and public spectacles fed one another. The cost and labor were immense, and that cost was part of the message. A menagerie demanded fodder, water, handlers, and constant repairs. Only a household with deep stores and many servants could keep such a machine running. Guests did not need ledgers to understand this. They could smell hay, hear the night watch, and see the scars on a handler's arms. Law and privilege mattered. Not everyone could own dangerous animals near the capital. Permissions were needed, and exemptions granted to the few whose status allowed it. The fact that a man could keep a pair of lions marked him as someone above ordinary rule. There was also an inner motive. To command a wild animal was to soothe fear. The empire lived with threats on distant frontiers and with plots at home. A ruler who could look at a chained predator and see it yield tasted a private comfort. That feeling, however small, kept the cages full. These collections were fragile. A harsh winter killed tropical birds. A careless servant left a gate unbolted and paid with his life. When an owner fell from favor, the animals were sold, sent to the games, or starved. Yet while they lasted, they shaped memory. Poets wrote of bright feathers at dusk. Children learned the names of keepers. Visitors returned to the city whispering of wonders seen without a crowd. From arena to villa, the meaning of animals shifted. In public, they proclaimed the empire to the masses. In private, they whispered it to a chosen few. Both forms served the same purpose. They taught Rome to believe that the world and its creatures were pliant in Roman hands. In that belief lay comfort, vanity, and the shadow of decline. If the arena displayed the power of Rome to the people, the private menageries of emperors revealed something more intimate and often more disturbing about the men who ruled the empire. These collections were not simply about wealth. They exposed the eccentricities of emperors who blurred the line between ruler, showman, and obsessive collector. Caligula is perhaps the most infamous example. History remembers him for excess, cruelty, and madness, but his fascination with animals was also legendary. Ancient sources claim that he housed exotic creatures in his gardens and even spoke of appointing his beloved horse Incitatus to a position of high office. The story may be exaggerated, yet it captures a truth about how emperors projected their uniqueness through animals. By elevating a horse beyond its natural role, Caligula was declaring that in his Rome, the ordinary rules of the world no longer applied. Domitian, who reigned later in the 1st century, took a different approach. He filled his villa with lions and leopards, using them to impress guests at private banquets. Imagine walking through marble halls lit by oil lamps and hearing the muffled growl of a lion from a nearby chamber. It was not only a display of wealth, but a reminder of danger. The emperor alone could command such power and still dine calmly within reach of beasts. The threat was as much psychological as physical. Guests left in awe, perhaps also in fear. Then there was Elagabalus, the young emperor from the 3rd century, whose reign became notorious for decadence. He surrounded himself with exotic birds and animals, and reports tell of bizarre feasts where guests were showered with rose petals until some suffocated. Animals featured not merely as ornaments, but as tools in his theatre of excess. By turning his court into a stage filled with creatures far from their natural homes, he reinforced his own reputation as both unpredictable and untouchable. Not every imperial fascination was cruel. Some emperors kept animals out of genuine curiosity. Hadrian, remembered as a lover of Greek culture and architecture, collected a wide variety of animals in his villa at Tivoli. His interest was not in blood spectacle, but in observation. The villa's grounds contained elaborate gardens, pools, and even reconstructed landscapes where creatures from across the empire could be admired. For him, animals were a way to bring the diversity of Rome's provinces into a single, controlled environment, almost like a living encyclopedia. Still, even these gentler collections carried weighty symbolism. To walk through Hadrian's gardens and see beasts from Egypt, Africa, and the East was to be reminded that the empire stretched across the known world. What better proof of power than to make foreign landscapes bloom in Italy, populated by creatures brought at great cost? Private animal passions sometimes reflected insecurity. Emperors surrounded themselves with creatures they could dominate because human loyalty was harder to guarantee. A lion would obey so long as it was caged and fed. Courtiers might not. In this way, animals became symbols of both grandeur and isolation. They showed the emperor's ability to control nature, but they also highlighted his distance from ordinary life. These personal menageries blurred into myth. Visitors wrote of them with tones of both wonder and unease, feeding the image of the emperor as someone almost divine. To the Roman public, stories of Caligula's horse or Elagabalus's strange feasts were both scandalous and magnetic. They confirmed that emperors lived on a plane where no boundary, not of wealth, not of reason, seemed to apply. Through these peculiar companions, emperors revealed themselves. Some were cruel, some curious, some simply vain, but all used animals to shape their image. The Colosseum may have roared with thousands of beasts, but in the quiet gardens and banquet halls of the Palatine Hill, the presence of a single lion or a horse dressed in jewels spoke just as loudly of power unrestrained. Beyond the roar of the Colosseum and the whispers of private villas, Roman emperors sought permanence for their obsessions by building collections that resembled what we might call zoos. These were not open to the public in the way we understand today. They were imperial showcases, extensions of the palace itself, carefully curated to demonstrate the reach of Roman rule. Imagine walking through the vast gardens of the Palatine Hill, where marble statues and fountains stood alongside cages of lions, leopards, and even elephants. The layout was not random. Each creature represented a conquered land. To stroll past them was to take a miniature tour of Rome's empire without leaving the capital. The animal pens were living trophies, reminders that conquest was not only about land or people, but also about bending nature itself into submission. Some emperors invested heavily in these collections. Augustus, the first emperor, was known to have displayed crocodiles from Egypt in an artificial pond during one of his triumphs. The symbolism was clear. Rome had not only taken Egypt, but had transported its most dangerous creatures to the heart of the empire. Later, emperors expanded this practice. The zoological gardens grew into status symbols, competing with the wonders of earlier kings and pharaohs. The logistical effort behind these zoos was staggering. Animals had to be captured, fed, and transported across thousands of miles. Giraffes and rhinoceroses traveled by ship. Bears and wolves were dragged from forests. Exotic birds were carried in wicker cages through deserts and mountains. Every successful delivery was proof that the empire's roads, ports, and soldiers could accomplish miracles. To the emperor, each beast was not just an animal, but a testament to Roman logistics and control. For guests invited to see these menageries, the impression was unforgettable. A senator or foreign ambassador walking into such a space could not miss the message. The emperor ruled a world so vast that even nature's fiercest beasts bowed before him. Unlike coins or statues, which carried propaganda through art, the zoos were propaganda made flesh and blood. There was also a philosophical dimension. Romans often spoke of dominion over nature as the highest expression of civilization. To tame wild rivers with aqueducts, to level hills for roads, to drain swamps for farms. All of this was considered proof of Roman superiority. The imperial zoos fit this same pattern. To control the wildness of animals was to show that no part of creation lay beyond Rome's reach. But there was a darker truth behind the spectacle. The animals often lived short and miserable lives, torn from their natural environments and forced into confinement. Many died during transport. Others perished in unsuitable climates. What impressed the Roman elite as a marvel of power was, in reality, a cycle of cruelty sustained by endless demand. This tension between wonder and waste reflected the empire itself, magnificent but ruthless. Some emperors turned their zoos into semi-religious symbols. Exotic animals were linked to gods or provinces. A panther might evoke the god Dionysus, while an elephant could symbolize Africa. By walking among these beasts, the emperor was staging himself as a mediator between gods, lands, and people. The zoo became not only a symbol of wealth, but also a theater of cosmic order, with the emperor at its center. The legacy of these imperial collections did not end with Rome. Later courts in Byzantium, the Islamic caliphates, and medieval Europe copied the practice of keeping exotic animals as royal treasures. The idea that ruling meant commanding nature itself can be traced directly back to these Roman gardens. When you see paintings of Renaissance princes showing off lions or parrots, you are witnessing echoes of the imperial habit. In the end, the Roman zoos tell us as much about the rulers as the animals. They reveal a world where power was measured not just in armies and laws, but in the ability to summon distant landscapes into the emperor's backyard. For the people who walked those marble paths and heard the growl of a caged beast, the message was unmistakable. Rome was eternal, and even the wild obeyed its will. The deeper one looks into the private worlds of the emperors. The clearer it becomes that their fascination with animals was more than curiosity or strategy. It was extravagance pushed to the point of absurdity, a reflection of rulers so distant from ordinary life that their passions no longer made sense to the people they governed. Take the emperor Caligula. He is often remembered for his erratic behavior, but among his strangest habits was the way he elevated animals into the sphere of politics. His beloved horse, Incitatus, was dressed in purple blankets, housed in a marble stable, and fed oats mixed with flakes of gold. Some sources even claim Caligula planned to make the horse a consul, though historians debate whether this was literal or symbolic mockery of the Senate. Either way, the image is striking. In a world where citizens struggled to survive, the ruler's horse enjoyed luxuries beyond the reach of Rome's elite. Other emperors followed similar paths of extravagance. Elagabalus, for example, became infamous for hosting banquets where exotic animals were not simply displayed, but turned into bizarre props for entertainment. He was said to release lions, leopards, or bears into the dining hall, sometimes tame and sometimes wild, watching his guests panic or marvel as they tried to eat while surrounded by beasts. On other occasions, he reportedly served dishes prepared with animal parts rarely used as food, ostrich, brains, or camel heels, simply to shock and amuse. These events reveal a court detached from reality, where extravagance itself was the measure of power. Maintaining these habits required immense resources. Imperial treasuries funded endless shipments of animals, feed, cages, trainers, and handlers. The money that might have repaired roads or funded legions was diverted into keeping a giraffe alive in an Italian climate or staging a new spectacle in the arena. To ordinary Romans, who often depended on grain handouts to avoid starvation, such displays must have felt like both a marvel and an insult. There was also a psychological element. For emperors constantly fearing conspiracy, animals became companions that seemed safer than people. A horse or a lion posed no threat of betrayal in the political sense. They could be loyal symbols, comforting presences, or even substitutes for human relationships. In this light, Caligula's devotion to his horse looks less like comedy and more like a symptom of loneliness at the top of absolute power. Yet, however irrational, these obsessions reinforced the emperor's aura. To host a dinner surrounded by beasts no one else could hope to acquire was to remind everyone that the emperor's life existed on another level. Even cruelty could be a tool of authority. When thousands of animals were slaughtered in one day for a single festival, the point was not only to entertain the crowd, but to overwhelm them with a vision of resources so vast that they bordered on the infinite. This extravagance, however, had costs. Importing and killing animals on such a scale strained trade routes and disrupted ecosystems in the lands Rome controlled. Entire regions of North Africa saw their lion populations decline because of constant hunting for the games. Elephants became rarer, rhinos scarcer, and many species were pushed closer to disappearance. In pursuing entertainment and prestige, the emperors reshaped nature in ways that carried long shadows into history. The detachment of the emperors from reality mirrored the decline of the empire itself. As rulers indulged in private fantasies, the needs of the provinces and the army were neglected. Extravagant shows could keep the crowd quiet for a day, but they did not solve deeper problems of governance, corruption, or war. In this sense, the obsession with exotic animals was more than eccentricity. It was a symptom of a system drifting away from balance, consuming wealth, and lives in displays that dazzled but solved nothing. When we read these stories now, they seem unbelievable, almost theatrical. A horse living better than senators, a dinner where guests ate while beasts prowled between couches, a treasury drained so that an emperor could boast of a hippo in his villa. Yet for centuries this was Rome at its height. These details remind us that power, once it grows unchecked, often expresses itself through extravagance rather than reason. The imperial fascination with animals was not just about entertainment, nor even about politics. It was about rulers losing touch with the world that sustained them, creating a private universe where reality bent to their will. The men who commanded legions and ruled continents also wasted fortunes feeding lions, pampering horses, and staging scenes that blurred the line between luxury and madness. That detachment, as much as their conquests, defined what it meant to be an emperor of Rome. The Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents, binding together an astonishing variety of climates, landscapes, and peoples. From the deserts of North Africa to the damp forests of Germania, from the rugged highlands of Britain to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, Rome drew its wealth and identity from diversity. That reach did not only mean grain, marble, or soldiers, it also meant animals. Exotic creatures became a living testimony to imperial power. When a lion roared inside the Colosseum, it was more than a sound from Africa. It was the empire itself announcing that there was no boundary too far, no frontier beyond its grasp. The logistics behind this were immense. To bring an elephant from India or a crocodile from the Nile was not a matter of one caravan or one ship. It meant coordination across provinces, traders, handlers, and imperial officials. The fact that Rome could demand and receive such animals was itself a performance of control. A local ruler or governor who sent a giraffe to the emperor was signaling loyalty as much as tribute. The gift was not only the animal, but also the proof that Rome's reach was absolute. Spectacle always carried political weight in Rome. Emperors knew that their legitimacy was not secured only through armies or decrees, but through the ability to astonish and overwhelm the people. Exotic animals were perfect tools for this. They were unfamiliar, dangerous, and expensive. To parade them in front of crowds in the capital was to show that the emperor could command the natural world itself. The more improbable the animal, the stronger the message. A rhino crashing across sand in the arena said something that no speech could. Rome rules everywhere. This obsession was not limited to public shows. Wealthy aristocrats imitated imperial habits by keeping menageries on their estates. To own a bear or a rare bird was to echo imperial grandeur on a smaller scale. The empire became a network not only of military garrisons and tax offices, but of living symbols distributed across villas and gardens. Animals, torn from their habitats, were absorbed into the Roman way of displaying dominance. They were proof that even nature could be reshaped into status. The reach of Rome then was measured not only in roads and aqueducts, but in the beating hearts of animals carried far from home. Each shipment was a reminder that the empire could mobilize resources across thousands of miles. Each roar or bellow in a Roman amphitheater was the echo of distant conquests. For the ordinary citizen, who might never leave the city walls, seeing such creatures confirmed that Rome was truly without rival. The empire was vast, but it was also personal. Its might condensed into the trembling of the ground as an elephant entered the stage. And so, exotic animals became a mirror of Rome's ambition. They represented not just control of land, but of imagination. By making the impossible appear ordinary by turning wild beasts into everyday entertainment, the emperors showed that their empire had no limits. The animals told the story of Rome more vividly than monuments. They walked proof that the world itself had been gathered under one name, one power, one rule. The spectacle of exotic animals in Rome dazzled the crowds, but behind that spectacle lay a story of loss. For every roar that thrilled the audience, there was a long chain of capture, transport, and death that most Romans never considered. The animals did not arrive willingly. They were torn from their homes, driven across deserts, forced onto ships, and dragged into a world they could not understand. The Colosseum was their final stage, and almost never their escape. The numbers alone are staggering. Ancient writers speak of festivals where thousands of creatures were killed in a single series of games. Lions from North Africa, elephants from India, leopards from the Caucasus, even ostriches and flamingos, all of them became part of the Roman appetite for novelty and blood. A grand event was not measured only by the architecture or the music, but by the sheer scale of the slaughter. To give the people a memorable show meant extinguishing entire herds, sometimes entire populations. The effect on nature was severe. Certain species that once roamed freely in North Africa began to vanish. Lions, once common across the region, were hunted so heavily for Roman games that their numbers collapsed. The same happened with hippos in the Nile and with wild elephants in parts of North Africa and Syria. Rome's craving for spectacle pushed ecosystems to the edge. Today, when we think of extinction as a modern crisis, it is sobering to realize that Roman arenas played their own role in wiping out species centuries ago. The suffering was not limited to the animals themselves. Their capture demanded human labor, often dangerous and brutal. Hunters and handlers risked their lives to trap wild beasts. Caravans crossed harsh landscapes where many died before reaching the coast. On ships, animals were packed tightly, chained, and weakened by hunger. By the time they reached Rome, some were half dead already, yet still marched into the arena to fight or to fall. For the empire, this was simply the cost of entertainment. For those involved, it was misery, repeated countless times. Even the animals that survived the journey faced only brief futures. The venaciones, or animal hunts, were designed to end in death. Lions fought gladiators, elephants were driven into pits, rhinos faced spearmen. Sometimes animals were forced to fight one another, turned into living weapons for the crowd's delight. The cruelty was both deliberate and celebrated. The louder the death, the more thrilling the spectacle. To Roman eyes, these creatures were not beings, but props, raw material for the empire's endless theater. Yet there were exceptions. A few emperors occasionally spared animals, either to demonstrate mercy or to astonish the crowd by releasing them again. But such moments were rare and often symbolic. Mercy itself became another form of display, proving the emperor's generosity rather than any real compassion. For the animals, survival was almost never granted. Their fate was sealed long before the gates opened. What is striking is how quickly this suffering faded from memory. Roman writers describe the excitement, the grandeur, the applause. They rarely pause to reflect on the agony of the animals or the destruction of their homelands. To the Romans, nature was infinite and conquerable. The idea that one day lions might vanish from North Africa or elephants disappear from Syria would have seemed unthinkable. And yet, that is exactly what happened. The fate of these animals, then, was not only death in the arena, it was also erasure. They became invisible victims of history, remembered only in passing lines of ancient texts, their lives reduced to statistics of games long past. Their bones were swept from the sand, their species weakened, their suffering forgotten. The crowd cheered, the emperor smiled, and the empire moved on, never pausing to count the true cost. When we look back at the Roman obsession with exotic animals, it is easy to feel horror. How could a civilization so advanced in engineering, law, and culture indulge in such cruelty? The answer lies not only in entertainment, but in the psychology of power. For the emperors, animals were not creatures to protect or study. They were instruments through which authority was displayed, a living stage where dominance over nature and over people was confirmed. Every appearance of a lion, elephant, or rhino in the arena was a statement. Rome can reach anywhere, capture anything, and bend it to its will. The death of the animal was not just spectacle, it was a demonstration that the empire itself was limitless. To kill what was rare was to prove control over rarity. To make the impossible commonplace was to show that nothing lay beyond Rome's grasp. The cruelty, therefore, was not incidental, it was central to the message. But cruelty always reveals something deeper about those who wield it. The emperors who ordered mass hunts or paraded animals through the Colosseum were not simply entertaining crowds. They were also reinforcing distance. By treating life itself as expendable, they separated themselves from the ordinary values of empathy and balance. To the crowd, the sight of a bleeding lion was a thrill. To the emperor, it was confirmation of his untouchable status. When cruelty becomes a language of power, compassion fades into weakness. The detachment of Rome toward animals mirrored its detachment toward people. Gladiators, prisoners, and slaves were thrown into the arena alongside beasts, often with equally brutal fates. The line between human and animal blurred, not because Romans saw animals as elevated, but because they saw humans as lowered. A defeated soldier or condemned criminal was no different in practice from a captured lion. Both were bodies to be broken in front of an audience. This was the darker truth of imperial power. Once cruelty is normalized, it spreads without boundary. It is tempting to imagine that ordinary Romans saw the injustice, that some voice in the crowd cried out against the slaughter. Yet, the records give us little sign of resistance. For most, the games were a gift from the emperor, a distraction from daily struggle, and a reminder of belonging to the empire's vast machinery. Ethical questions rarely troubled the masses. Survival mattered more than sympathy, and so the cruelty persisted, unchallenged, until centuries later, when the empire itself collapsed. Still, the legacy of these spectacles forces us to confront uncomfortable questions today. What does it mean when power entertains itself through destruction? What happens when the suffering of others, whether animal or human, is hidden behind the language of glory, tradition, or necessity. Rome shows us that cruelty, once embedded in culture, becomes invisible. The crowd does not see the blood. It sees only the emperor's generosity. The people do not count the lives lost. They count only the hours of distraction. Ethically, Rome's obsession exposes the danger of detachment. To view animals as expendable was also to view nature as conquerable, infinite, and without limits. To view people as expendable was to normalize slavery, execution, and mass spectacle. Both patterns came from the same root, the belief that power justifies any use of life. This belief allowed emperors to act without guilt and allowed citizens to cheer without pause. In reflecting on Rome, we are invited to examine ourselves. The cruelty of the past may seem distant, yet the structure remains recognizable. Whenever life is treated as material for profit, power, or amusement, the same detachment is at work. The Romans did it openly, under the sun of the Colosseum. We may do it in quieter ways. The ethical lesson is clear. To see cruelty as normal is to accept the erosion of empathy, both toward others and toward ourselves. Rome's arenas are ruins now, but the questions remain alive. What do our spectacles say about us? What lives do we overlook for the sake of convenience or pleasure? To remember the cruelty of Rome is not only to judge the past. It is also to warn the present that power, once divorced from empathy, repeats the same patterns: grand, ruthless, and unsustainable. When we step back from the details, the cages, the ships, the arenas, we see that Rome's obsession with exotic animals was not just a curiosity of history, it was a mirror of the empire itself. Magnificent, vast, and awe-inspiring, yet also brutal, fragile, and ultimately unsustainable. The animals brought to Rome told the same story as the provinces conquered by its armies. The world was Rome's to command, but the cost of that command was always higher than it seemed. Every elephant paraded through the streets, every lion loosed into the Colosseum, every giraffe displayed in a villa's garden was a symbol. These animals stood for the empire's reach, its wealth, and its ambition, but they also stood for its excess, its cruelty, and its blindness to limits. The further Rome stretched to capture and display life from distant corners of the world, the more it revealed its own hunger for control. That hunger never rested. It was never satisfied. Like the crowds who demanded more blood, Rome itself demanded more conquest, more spectacle, more proof of dominance. And yet, nothing endless is ever secure. The animals themselves could not endure it. Populations were drained, habitats disrupted, species hunted near to disappearance, all to satisfy a moment's applause. The empire, too, could not endure. Its resources thinned, its borders stretched, and its power hollowed out under the weight of its own demands. The obsession with animals in this sense, was not separate from its history. It was a reflection of the very forces that would undo it. There is something almost poetic in the image. A lion roaring in the arena, the crowd cheering, the emperor raising his hand. For a moment, Rome looked eternal, but the lion dies. The crowd disperses. The emperor fades into memory. What remains is the silence after the spectacle. That silence is the truest symbol of empire, not the roar, but the absence that follows. The cruelty of Rome's animal obsession may feel distant, but the pattern is timeless. Power that consumes without restraint eventually consumes itself. Wealth that flaunts its reach without care eventually weakens the foundation it rests upon. Rome's zoos and games were not just entertainment, they were warnings written in blood and sand. Warnings that still whisper today, and yet, to reflect on this does not need to disturb our rest. History, after all, speaks softly when we listen at night. The story of Rome's animals is not only a tale of violence, it is also a reminder of scale. Civilizations rise higher than any creature, yet they too fall. In the long rhythm of time, every roar becomes an echo, every empire becomes a ruin, and every obsession becomes a memory. So as you drift into calm tonight, think of the strange menageries of the emperors, the cages filled with creatures far from home, the gardens where camels and leopards once walked, the arenas where elephants trumpeted in confusion. Think of them not as horrors, but as signals markers of a world both powerful and vulnerable. They remind us that greatness and destruction often walk side by side, and that even the strongest hands cannot hold eternity. Rome's animals are gone. The emperors who paraded them are gone. The Colosseum still stands, but it too is only a shell, its silence deeper than its roar ever was. What remains is the lesson, carried gently across centuries, that power dazzles, but it also destroys. That cruelty entertains, but it also corrodes. And that history, no matter how loud in its moment, always falls quiet in the end. And in that quiet, we can rest.